All right, now we're ready. All right, so today I have the pleasure of introducing Charlie Borowicz. They are the Transgender Health Project Manager for the Allegheny Health Network through the Center of Inclusion and Health. They coordinate trainings and education across the health system, review policies and procedures, and serve as liaison to the Tri-State Gender Collaborative and PA Transgender Health Task Force. They work closely with the STAR Center to provide simulation and scripted scenario training to nursing residents. Charlie is an internal advocate for gender-based, expansive patients and works to improve the healthcare experience for the community.
Thanks. I don't know how this works. Can you hear me? Yeah. Beautiful. All right. So just so everybody knows, this is a way larger room than I'm used to presenting to. So if anybody wants to participate and/or is going to heckle, I request that you move up to the front. Otherwise, if you don't come to me, I will come find you. This is an interactive presentation. It's not just going to be me yapping for an hour. So get ready, because if you're not up here, I'm going to come after you. So we're going to talk about microaggressions, misgendering, and implicit bias, and how that informs our language and how that ends up impacting trauma. It's a whole lot of information in a very short period of time. Please ask questions, and no questions, bad question, but you might need a microphone. So, if anybody started the Center for Inclusion Health, this grew out of the Positive Health Clinic. So this is our HIV and AIDS clinic on the North Shore of Pittsburgh. We use a primary care transformation model to address social determinants of health that prevent people from getting good health care. So a few of the programs that we have, I know this is a little bit small, but they're listed down there. We have addiction medicine, street medicine, immigrant and refugee health, behavioral health integration, our Healthy Food Initiative, and of course my favorite, the Transgender Health Project, because that's what I do. So, some things that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about how recurring trauma occurs with microaggressions and with being misgendered. We're going to talk about how those small traumas can be triggers for vicarious trauma or past trauma. And we're going to talk about the role that implicit bias plays in language and how we can combat these biases and challenge the way that we talk about folks. Just so everybody knows, like I said, there is a lot of heavy content. We are going to talk about some very difficult things. There's going to be some very difficult things to hear in this conversation. For a very important reason, we are going to still proceed with it, but if this makes anybody uncomfortable, anything that's listed up here, please feel free to step out. Don't hesitate to do so if you need to. Did I see a hand, or are you just itching? All right. Hi, Gary. How you doing? All right. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to follow this person throughout the course of her day. So this is a fictitious person, not you. This is somebody else named Jasmine who's not in the room. This has not been a real experience that she has had. But this Jasmine is a transgender woman. She's 26. She lives in Pittsburgh. So she's a local. She doesn't like gritty. She dresses feminine, identifies as female. She's recently started growing her hair longer. She has not had any gender-affirming surgeries and is not taking hormone replacement. So Jasmine's on her way to the doctor's appointment to see about getting hormone replacement. So we're going to follow her through her day. We're going to see how this goes for her. So the first thing she does is she gets on a bus. And the bus driver, being polite, says to her, "Good morning, sir." And then she goes and sits down, doesn't really acknowledge the bus driver, and hears people talking, saying, "Why is he dressed like that?" On the way, she gets a phone call from a telemarketer, we'll say. And the telemarketer says, "Is Lewis there? Can I speak with Lewis, please? Can I speak with him?" She gets to her doctor's appointment, and as I'm sure a lot of us in the room have had this experience, she has to look at these two restrooms and say, do I look feminine enough to go into the women's bathroom? Do I look masculine enough to go into the men's bathroom? If I go into either of these spaces, am I going to get followed? Am I going to get yelled at? Am I going to get beat up? Which of these is going to be the least unsafe or the least uncomfortable for me? This is situations that I am in on a daily basis as a gender-neutral person, so very real situation that happens. She goes and she sits down in the waiting room of her doctor's office. A few minutes later, the MA comes out, says, "Is Lewis here? Right this way, sir." Again, very much trying to be polite, trying to address the person with honorifics, with formalities. And she goes in to do her vital signs. The MA, again, trying to be reassuring, tells her, "Your heart rate and blood pressure are right in the normal range for a man your age." We don't follow her into her doctor's office, that's confidential. After her appointment, she gets into it, she calls an Uber, and she opens the door to find her Uber driver, who says, "I'm here to pick up Jasmine. You must be waiting for somebody else. You're clearly not Jasmine." So What does Jasmine do next? She goes for a little bit of retail therapy because we've all been there. We know that can be really helpful. So she's shopping, and the clerk comes over and says, "Are you looking for something for your girlfriend?" And when Jasmine says no, the clerk tells her, "The men's section's on the other side of the store. You should probably go over there." So again, very upset. Jasmine goes in to get some coffee because, what else do you do in this situation? Just get some caffeine. And she goes up to the counter and says, they ask for her name. She says, "My name's Jasmine." The person at the counter kind of looks at her a little bit funny, but they don't say anything. And then she goes to the end of the line to get her coffee and gets told, "Here's your coffee. You have a nice day, sir." At this point, what happens to Jasmine? How does she feel? She is not having a nice day. So she flips out, of course, because we see that everything that she's gone through that day has been so invalidating, right? So of course we see why this is happening. This person at the coffee shop has no idea why she's this angry at this point, because they haven't been with her throughout the course of this entire day. So, somebody tell me how Jasmine's feeling. Exhausted, absolutely. What else?
Suicidal.
She may be suicidal. Oh,
Angry and rejected.
angry and rejected or dejected?
Rejected.
Okay, either one was right. I just wanted to make sure. What else? Misunderstood, absolutely. Oh.
Disrespected.
Very disrespected, right. So these are all these feelings that have been bubbling up all day, every single time that this all happened, right? This isn't just a one-off thing, this is all day for her. And again, by this point it's what, 1 o'clock in the afternoon? She still has the rest of the day to go through and hope that it's going to be better than what she's experienced for the first half of her day. Thinking in the terms of trauma, how safe did Jasmine feel today in any of these circumstances?
Not very safe.
Not very safe. Where do we think she felt the most unsafe?
Bathroom.
Bathroom? Doctor's office. Okay. So kicking back to the doctor's office, remember we didn't follow her into her doctor's appointment, but given what we saw leading up to that appointment and how she was feeling after that appointment, how do we predict that that appointment probably went? It seemed like a very trans-affirming office? Not particularly. Of course, we don't know. Maybe the doctor was fine. Who knows? But for the most part, we're probably going to assume that that doctor was not a good experience for her. So when somebody has these situations happen over and over and over again, it can impact health both physically and mentally in very negative ways. We know that stress can impact health. We're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. Like I said, this is an interactive presentation, so I hope you're all ready. I need about 20 volunteers, roughly. I'm just going to start passing them out, so I'm going to pick on you because I walk your dog. Nope. Okay. That's why I'm in social services and not in tech. There you go. Exactly. You want one? Okay. Actually, okay. Pass that on that side. I'm going to go back to this side. Thank you. Oh, that would be great. Thank you. While I reposition myself. I knew this thing was going to fall off. All right. So what I'm passing out right now are some microaggressions. These are not things I'm saying to anybody in the room, for the record. So what I'd like you to do is, when everybody who wants one has one, take a look at what you have in your hand. And the first thing I want is for anybody who thinks the statement they have in their hand isn't that bad, or they can't see why it's a microaggression. Does anybody have one that seems that way? Guess not. I pass out the wrong cards. Try flipping it over if you have it. No, I'm just kidding. There's nothing like that. You might take.
You look like a real man. If you hadn't told me, I would have never known.
Okay. So that's something that some people consider to be validating or consider to be polite is you look like a real man. If you hadn't told me you were trans, I would have never known. That's something that cis people tend to say sometimes when they're trying to be affirming and to trans individuals. Why might that not be the most affirming thing you can say?
You said real man? That sounds
Yeah.
very judgmental.
Yeah,
What does that mean to be a real man?
exactly. So what are the criteria for being a real man? What does that look like? What were you expecting when I told you that I was trans? Right, good. Does anybody have another one? I see 2 hands.
They
Free.
are a real man already.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. So does anybody else have another one that doesn't seem terrible or doesn't seem particularly... Hey, what about? Go ahead.
Your record has a different gender marker.
Okay, gotcha. So what she said was your record, so your medical record has a different gender marker. Why might that be difficult for somebody to hear? Why might that be a microaggression?
It'll be exhausting to explain that every single time.
Right.
I know in our medical office, sometimes you tell people something, like your new insurance, for example, and then the next time you come to rejection. So you
Right.
explain it again.
Yeah, so for anybody who didn't hear her, you need to go in, you need to explain it every single time you go into the office. Every time you change something about your medical record, you have to say it over and over and over again. But also, is gender on the medical record? Or is it sex? 99 times out of 100, gender is not on the medical record. Your sex is. So when somebody tells you that your gender marker is incorrect on the medical record, they're the ones misspeaking because your gender isn't identified in the medical record in most cases. Also, if anybody knows how to put that in Epic, I'm looking at you. You better come find me after this. All right, so who has one that kind of sounds kind of bad, but isn't great? Isn't really very good to say. Go ahead.
Mommy, is that a man or a woman?
No. That's what I say to kids when they ask me that. They're like, are you a man or a woman? No, and then I just keep walking.
And kids are like, cool.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, okay, can I pet your dog? Like, they really don't care. Yeah. So this could go a number of ways. So this can either lead into a good conversation where the parent is very affirming and says, you know, not everybody is a man or a woman. Not everybody has to look a certain way to be a man or a woman. Some people are a little bit of both. Some people are a little bit of neither, whatever it is. Or mom can just be a jerk and say, I don't know, but they shouldn't be dressed like that. Whatever it is that the person decides to say. Great. What other ones do we have that are kind of bad but not terribly egregious? Go ahead.
I want to see your post-operative results.
Oh. Everybody hear that one? I want to see your post-op results. So that one's pretty bad. What's bad about that one?
Well, I said that because it's something that I deal with family members, and they think that that's affirming when somebody's had top surgery, that they want to help that person. So they think it's not, I know, that face says wrong.
Right.
It is wrong.
Asking someone to show any parts of their body just because you're curious is not okay, which is a thing that should be obvious after like kindergarten, but isn't always obvious, especially when we're talking about healthcare providers and especially when we're talking about people with trans bodies. A lot of times folks who are trans are forced or asked to expose themselves in ways that are not necessary for the medical interaction, and a question like that can completely derail a healthcare interaction. Absolutely. All right, now who has one that's absolutely terrible? Go ahead.
Did you see that transgender person in the coffee shop? He is clearly never going to pass as a real woman.
Right. So again, things that some of us have overheard in public sometimes is that person's never going to pass as a real woman. As M had said earlier, that person is a real woman. Whether or not you perceive them that way, that person is a real woman, that's their identity, that's how they're to be perceived, that's how they're to be respected. Great. What else? Go ahead.
We don't have any safe housing for homeless transgender people.
Yeah, that's a problem, isn't it? Yeah. Does anybody work in homeless services?
Can you repeat that?
Sorry? They said we don't have any safe housing for homeless transgender people. So what makes that a microaggression?
They're labeled. They're labeled as someone different than just the average cis person.
Okay. So they're labeled as something different, right? What else?
We don't hire trainees.
Oh.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you say trainees?
Sorry.
Yes. Right. So again, that's a very offensive word. It's a very outdated word. It's not trainees. That's not something that you should ever say to somebody, especially in a hiring situation. Right. Somebody want to share another one?
So, you want to cut off your penis?
Oh, good God. Yeah. So again, asking people about their private parts, not appropriate. We're kind of getting the hang of this here, right? All right. Go ahead.
Excuse me, I think you're in the wrong bathroom.
You know, I get told that no matter where I pee. It's really upsetting. Especially when they do what they think is the very subtle thing of they walk in, they see me, they tilt their head, they slam the door shut, look at the sign, look at me, and then walk in very slowly with their back to the wall. And I'm like, I'm just here for the same reason you are. If you're here for a different purpose, we should maybe have a conversation. But I hope you know where you are. I hope that you're not having some, memory loss or something that's going on. Whatever. Anyway, so yes, that can be a very aggressive statement. That can make somebody feel very unsafe if you're calling them out as somebody who, quote, doesn't belong in that restroom. I see your hand in the back.
You are sick trying to fool people into thinking you have the opposite sex. Yes.
Right, so you're sick trying to fool people into thinking you're the opposite sex. That is a very strong one. Okay. All right. Any questions on that so far? Great. All right. So the reason these are all microaggressions is because of the underlying or perceived meaning that people put onto them. So when somebody says, I couldn't even tell you weren't a real man or a real woman, the underlying or perceived meaning from that person is that you're not a real man or not a real woman, which we already talked about is not the case. That there's a correct way to look male or look female. And if you didn't pass, so if you weren't, if you didn't appear to be masculine or appear to be feminine, then therefore your identity would not be valid. So these are all the things that people are hearing when somebody says something like, I couldn't even tell you weren't blah, 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 which some people can tend to think is valid, or validating, but that's what comes behind it. So it's hard for me to remember you're trans since you still look like a man or you still look like a woman. What does that have behind it? What's the meaning behind that?
You have to look a certain way.
Right, so you should look a certain way to be masculine or feminine. What else?
Your feelings don't matter.
Right, your feelings don't matter. This is about me. This is about my perception and my feelings. So the way you look is more important than your identity. And if you're not conforming to those accepted gender standards, nobody's going to take you seriously. Nobody's going to acknowledge you for who you are. What parts do you have? We've kind of already talked about this, about why it's inappropriate. Again, after kindergarten, we should all know this. The perceived meaning is that the fact that you're trans gives me carte blanche to ask you about your private parts, about things that normally I wouldn't ask a cis person about. And the parts tell, quote, what you really are. That's the underlying meaning there. These are both things that I have been told or asked. What is your real name? Or I've been told, I like your other name better. Again, going back to, this is about my feelings, this is not about yours, and your chosen name is just made up. It's not valid. So there's a lot of underlying meaning there. And then the last one is you have to be, no, it's not the last one. You have to be one gender or the other. So again, if somebody's non-binary, falling in the middle isn't something that this person considers that you can do. You're not valid as a non-binary person, and of course this false idea that there are only two genders. So this is the full definition of microaggressions. You are all here because you can read, so I'm not going to read it to you. But the things I want you to focus on is that these are subtle and unconscious and a lot of times unintentional. Some of them are intentional. We are going to talk about the difference between the intentional ones and unintentional ones. But this is the official definition. So there's 3 different types. First one are micro-invalidations. So comments that exclude, nullify, or negate the experience of a marginalized group of people. So who has one that they mentioned that would fall under micro-invalidation? Go ahead.
As soon as I saw you, I knew you were transgender.
Right. So if that person is trying to pass, telling them, as soon as I saw you, I knew you were trans, can be very invalidating, can completely derail their experience. Someone else? Go ahead.
Our other clients wouldn't be comfortable with your being here.
Right. So it no longer matters about that person's comfort. The statement was, our other clients wouldn't be comfortable with you being here. So saying that that person's comfort is not as important as the other client's comfort. Okay? Micro-assault. So these are the ones that we talked about kind of towards the end here. So verbal or nonverbal statements meant to hurt the victim. So name calling. I know there's a couple of name calling ones floating around out there. I'm okay if you don't say them. That would be an example of verbal. Nonverbal would be, you remember when we were on the bus with Jasmine and somebody was talking about her, if somebody had physically moved away from her on the bus, that would be a nonverbal microassault. So again, it's intended to hurt that person. And micro-insult, interpersonal environmental communication that conveys stereotypes, demeans aspects of identity, shows rudeness, insensitivity, all of that. So all of the ones that imply that there's only one way to present as a certain gender, all of that would fall under micro-insults. Questions on these so far? Yeah?
Where would you put intentional staring?
Intentional staring. Probably micro-assault.
That's nice.
Yeah, does anybody disagree or anybody have a different opinion? That's just what I would say, but yeah, the like hard, like trying to see through your pores to figure out what chromosomes you have, yeah, that's really uncomfortable. So this, stay with me, this is really long and it violates every rule of PowerPoint because it's tiny and there's a lot of text. This is what we call the minority stress model. So what we see over here is that you have your minority status and your identity, how much you identify with being a person in a minority. And then you have stressors that come up. So you have stressors that come up in your daily life. So everything that Jasmine was experiencing throughout the day would be individual stressors. So those are experiences of prejudice, discrimination, violence, intentional staring, moving away from her, calling her sir, all of that. And then you have, in proximal minority, you have her internal processes. So her expectations of being rejected, her expectations that she's going to be followed or harassed or abused. She may conceal her transgender status at any point because she's afraid of what's going to happen. And you see how that leads into these things called allosteric states. And I must admit, I got this from another presenter, so I'm not going to explain it as well as a different person would. But again, stay with me. So allostasis is the stress response in the body. It's the sum of all the stress responses in the body. So as your cortisol levels increase, those are your stress hormones, heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, all of that all falls under allostasis. And what we have normally is this little peak. Oh, and I'm not being fair to this side of the room with the laser pointer. We have this little peak that goes up when you have that initial reaction. That's your fight or flight response. So imagine when you narrowly avoid a car accident and your whole system tenses up, right? And it gets really tense for a few seconds or a few minutes or a few hours, depending on what kind of driver you are, and you go back down afterwards, you kind of level back out. So that's the normal stress response. So what we run into when we have these microaggressions is you have these little spikes throughout the course of the day, where every time Jasmine is called the wrong name, every time Jasmine's called the wrong pronoun, every time she's redirected to the men's section of something or redirected to a different bathroom, she's having these little spikes. That's those repeated hits that you see on the first part of that purplish slide in the middle of the right there. So there's a few different ways that this can go about. She can have what's called lack of adaptation, where she has the same strong reaction every single time, where she blows up like Dorothy in the coffee shop every single time that this happens. That's a lack of adaptation. Normally what happens is with repeated stressors, your reaction tends to go down. So things that would normally startle you tends to reduce. She may not have that reduction happen. She could also go through something called prolonged response, where she's at that fight or flight level all day. So from the minute she gets on that bus, she is stressed out, she is ready to fight, she's ready to do whatever she needs to do to defend herself. And she could also have an inadequate response where she gets to the point that doesn't even affect her anymore. She doesn't even hear it. She's just sort of at this low level and nothing really phases her anymore. And we see with all of this abnormal, with all of these abnormal reactions, this puts an impact on both physical and mental health. Like I said, we already know that stress impacts the body, it impacts mental health in very negative ways long term. So that, and then the things that can contradict that are things like coping strategies, social supports, all of those things that are listed in the little triangle down at the bottom there. Did Jasmine have any supports with her while she was going through her day? No. Would any of this have been mitigated if she would have had a friend or a partner or an advocate floating around with her throughout the day? Probably a fair amount, right? She might have had somebody to interrupt those interactions and say, she would like to purchase clothes here, or she would like to use the bathroom, please let her use the bathroom. All of those different things can be really helpful. Important thing to remember about this model is that it's not just about one minority status. So, however you are imagining Jasmine, if you are imagining Jasmine as a white, able-bodied woman, then you just have her gender identity to contend with here. However, if Jasmine is a person of color, now she's experiencing not just those gendered microaggressions, she's also experiencing racial microaggressions. If she is a person of color who also gets around using a wheelchair or a cane, now she's having gender microaggressions, racial microaggressions, and she's gonna have to worry about accessibility everywhere she goes. She might be talked down to because she has a disability. She may be treated differently because she has a disability, because she's trans, or because she's a person of color. She's not going to know where that's coming from necessarily if somebody's treating her poorly without verbalizing why. But those are things that do add up, and it does mean an increase in those stress responses. So this is important when we talk about combined identities. We're talking about the entire identity of the person, the multiple identities of a person. It's not always just about being a racial minority, being a gender minority, or having an ability or disability. It's all of those things combined that go into somebody's experience of stress and into their allostatic load. So, you can see how a microaggression can be considered a trauma, right? Because every single time she's going through this, she's having this stress reaction. Also, these microaggressions can precede something that's more dangerous, more threatening, or painful. Maybe somebody calls her a name right before they attack her, or maybe that happened to one of her friends and she heard about it and she has some vicarious trauma from that. So the reason for her getting stressed out isn't just about the name, isn't just about the pronouns, isn't just about the words that are used, but also the situations in which these things happen. Because we know that we don't use words in a vacuum, right? A lot of times people will use words to hurt people before they use physical violence to hurt people. So, and again, we talked about the underlying meanings or perceptions to the person to which they're directed. Questions on that so far? Like I said, I know it's a lot of information. So, implicit bias is where these microaggressions come from. So this is an association that you don't realize you make. So when somebody says to you during a healthcare interaction, the nurse is going to come in to see you. A lot of us are going to expect that that person is going to be a woman or a female identified person, because that's kind of what we see in media a lot, that's what we see in children's books and so on. We're taught that a nurse equals a woman, doctor equals a man, which we all know is not the case. That's not true at all. There's plenty of genders in each profession, right? So these microaggressions come from implicit bias of, oh, you're really smart for a nurse, when you see a female practitioner and that person says to you, actually, I'm a doctor. What are you going to say?
So this question came up at the beginning of your example with Jasmine for
Yeah.
me. And I'm wondering either how things are handled at your clinic or other clinics. So when you're talking about Jasmine and the medical assistant assumed that they would be in either the looking at vital signs for a male or a female.
Right.
As a practitioner, or a program person supporting different programs, how is that handled in terms of identifying what scale patients should be assessed on?
Right. So there's, and that's a really good question. That's actually come up a number of times in training. She's asking about, or they, are asking about scales that are based on biological sex. So things like lab values, that sort of thing. The truth is there are very few lab values that are actually different based on sex. We tend to just break everything out into those two, but there's only a handful that it really makes an impact, whether you have more testosterone or more estrogen or whatever. So there is like a rule of thumb where if you've been on HRT for a certain period of time, you use one scale, and if you haven't, you use a different scale. Heart rate and blood pressure, to my knowledge, aren't one of those scales. So the idea there is, that's not even a thing you need to say, especially not to a 26-year-old person. All you need to say to that person is, your heart rate and blood pressure are normal. That's it. You don't have to identify gender in that circumstance. Does that make sense?
It does. I was just wondering, I'm thinking more along the lines of weight, or maybe folks who aren't taking hormones, how that's handled within your clinic.
So I don't have an answer because I don't see patients. I don't work in PHC, which is Positive Health Clinic. I can give you my recommendation as to how that conversation could go, or I could toss it over to the one person in the audience who probably doesn't want to talk about being in the actual clinic.
I mean, we have a bunch of, patients that come from all walks of life. We have transgender patients. We're used to working with transgender patients. So, I mean, I don't have a specific answer for you, but I know that that's not necessarily an issue because we advocate for that population.
Thank you. Yeah. The way that it's most affirming for me as a non-binary person is if you tell me people who were assigned X at birth or Y at birth, I'm using X and Y as algebra, not as chromosomes, but if somebody was assigned male or assigned female at birth, this is what's best health-wise for the body that you were given. That's, for me personally, what's the most affirming. I can't speak for everybody though, so. Other questions? I'm not used to turning my head this much. I feel like an addict. So everybody has these biases, and the way that we find that out is to take these implicit association tests. They're free, they're anonymous. You've probably heard of them before, but they go through a whole bunch of different stuff. They go through different race, different ability, gender identity, sexual orientation. You can take them online and find out where those biases are. Like I said, everybody has them. It's whether or not we acknowledge them that's going to determine how we deal with them. So they come from automatic thoughts and associations that we make. So stereotypes, they come from these automatic associations that we make based either on things that we've been told, things that we've experienced, or things that we've come to normalize in our lives. So for example, these are some examples of biases that somebody might have. People may have a preference to look at people who are familiar to them or for faces that look similar to theirs. People may think that biological men are more aggressive and biological women are more nurturing, and so on and so forth. And we know that none of these things really has any basis in fact. This is just an example of a bias that somebody may have. The good thing is, once we realize that we have these biases, if you say to yourself, you know what, I feel really uncomfortable when I'm the only person of my race in a room. I should really challenge that. I should figure out where that's coming from and see what I need to do to contradict that. Seek out these opportunities to be more open to challenging these. So the ways to work on this. First of all, you can't work on something you don't know exists. That's why it's implicit. It's underneath the surface. So taking the implicit association test is the first step. And again, it's free and anonymous. You don't have to worry that anybody's going to get your results. You're the only one that's going to know about it. Whatever it says, you don't have to worry that your boss is going to find out or that I'm going to come chatting through your computer about it. Notice when you make these assumptions about people. So when you go into that healthcare appointment and somebody says you're going to see a nurse, are you automatically assuming that a woman or a female identified person is going to walk into that room? If you do, that's an implicit association that you're making. That's a bias that you have. So you can challenge yourself and say, you know what, that could be a person of any gender that walks into this room. And it's a matter of challenging these and challenging these and challenging these until eventually you're overcoming those implicit associations that you're making. So again, in healthcare, are we assuming that every single transgender woman of color also has HIV? I've been told that by somebody during a presentation before, that was an assumption that was made about her in a healthcare appointment. It was very hurtful to her because she was HIV negative. Things like, do we assume that people who have a mental health diagnosis are also going to be unreliable? Again, not the case. So we want to make sure that we're challenging what these assumptions are about somebody. Think about when these associations or these assumptions infiltrate things like dress code. There's a whole lot in the news right now about whether or not people of color can wear natural hair at work and whether or not that's considered unprofessional. That idea of professionalism comes from a dominant culture. That doesn't come from any idea that has any merit whatsoever. But a lot of times you see things like that come through in dress code policies that don't make any sense. Our ideas, again, about professionalism and what constitutes health and beauty, what we're seeing on magazines, what we're seeing in media, those dominant ideas that say to us what is considered healthy or what is considered beautiful. And we, again, have to just challenge these thoughts constantly as they come up. Challenge them not only with yourself, but also with other people in your circles. What questions do we have? Way under time. Cool. Oh, go ahead.
How exactly do we deal with someone who thinks that their biases are completely justified? Like,
Besides fire them? Besides fire them?
well, yeah.
Can you give an example? Do you mind?
There are certain types of people that I've encountered online that call themselves like trans exclusionary radical feminists or TERFs.
Okay.
They basically try to hide their like transphobic ideas behind the guise of like they think there's an underlying feminism to what they believe. Like trans women are just men who want to prey on like women, or like they believe that trans men are just dealing with internalized misogyny or whatever.
Okay. It's a really good question. Have you found ways to contradict that, or?
I mean, I've been looking, but
yeah,
it's always better to get like more opinions.
Yeah. So I would challenge them to ask, what is their experience of being a woman, and how do you think that that differs from somebody who identifies as a woman but wasn't assigned female at birth? I would, again, if you want to have that conversation, that's a conversation that would give me too much anxiety and I'd just close the computer, but that's me personally. But you can open it with that and say, what are your ideas that are driving into that? Why do you assume that somebody would identify as a woman in order to prey on other women? That doesn't make any sense. Try and derail it from there. Might be a good start. Go ahead.
I did encounter a woman who identified themselves as a TERF, and it was in a healthcare setting, and my response was just directly back to regardless of what your beliefs are, your ethical beliefs of who should be with who, or whatever, whoever your ethical values are, healthcare is still necessary for everyone.
Right.
I'm like, and another one that I have come across that has been difficult to answer is in a clinical setting when this is a group setting with patients, when I identify myself as like an LGBT coordinator, and somebody makes comments like, what does that stand for? Liberty, guns, fear, Trump, I think is the acronym, or something like that. Or barbecue is the other day.
Oh, barbecue.
Barbecue or beer, I think. But when they say things like, oh, is that what that stands for? And, obviously, but it's in a clinical setting where that's still a patient.
I see.
And so I have to also be mindful of how I'm responding to them, because that's still a patient.
Sure. Yeah. Have you found a way to respond that's been?
No.
No. Okay. That's why it's a question and not a recommendation, right? So I get asked this actually a lot of if somebody challenges this and says, well, I'm not comfortable with a transgender woman in my OBGYN, or why is there a man sitting at my OBGYN office? Then in order to make sure that we're advocating for our more marginalized communities, we have to put ourselves in these really uncomfortable situations of saying, we serve all communities here. This person could, obviously we're not going to share information about this person, but we say we serve, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer populations. We serve blah, 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 so on and so forth. Letting people know that you're going to be providing the same level of care, similar to just said it. I was looking for the other person that said it, but you had a two-part question, so. So what you had said before, everybody needs health care, and it's not going to impact the care that this individual is receiving, but maybe just taking the time to do some education and explaining what that acronym is and why you're providing care to everybody. Does that kind of answer that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
What would you recommend is the best approach to allowing children to have open dialogue with adults that they're not related to? So for example, I'm walking through Target with my son, who's extremely curious, and we're a very open dialogue family. If he sees an individual and wants to ask questions, like how would you approach that? Or would you, or he wants to ask me a question, what would be the best response?
I mean, it definitely depends on what they're asking. If something as simple as, we don't know that person's gender identity because they haven't told us, and it's not polite for us to ask just out of curiosity, could be a good answer to give. If it's somebody that they're going to be interacting with, we can have this conversation of, well, I don't actually know, I can't answer for them, but let's talk about some ways that you could ask them that's going to make them feel welcome and make them feel like they can answer appropriately, if it's in relation to gender.
And that's what I was looking for, is what kind of questions would be appropriate to have a young child ask.
So, excuse me, do you mind if I ask what pronouns you use? Or do you mind if I ask what name I should call you, that sort of thing. Depending on the age of the child, of course, they may not have learned about pronouns yet. Drag everybody back to their SATs if they haven't. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Hi, I have a 13-year-old daughter, and maybe 2 years ago, they were about 11, 12. She goes to charter school with small classes, and I'm amazed at how open those kids are with each other, and she'll tell me some of her friends are gay, and they all talk about whether they're pan or this or that. And I said, oh my God, I can't believe it. But we took one of her friends home who goes by he and changed his name, but the mother still calls her by a girl's name, by Isis, which is a girl's name. Like, that's a situation where she actually got removed from the family because there was a lot of almost violence at home. But there's also another child who I just noticed the parents still call them by their original name and don't use the pronouns. So it's a little uncomfortable when even at school, I think the teachers are acknowledging their name and their pronouns, but the parents aren't. So I don't know. Was uncomfortable when I was standing there and the mom was calling her she and my daughter's calling her me.
Right. Yeah. And it sounds like it's even hard to use the appropriate pronouns as we're going through the situation.
Right.
So at that point, you decide, am I going to be a supporter of this person? Which it sounds like you're trying very hard to do that. So at that point, I don't care what the other parent's going to say. I'm going to affirm your child's gender. I'm going to call them him. I'm going to call them by the name that they choose. If that person has an issue with that, they can speak to me about it. And as long as, now the caveat with that is you want to make sure that the child has come out to that person already. So if the child hasn't come out to that person, I usually say to revert to gender neutrals, just so that you're not slipping up by using he or she. But again, that's a conversation to have with the child if you feel comfortable, and then have with the parent afterwards. So.
I work with the breast and cervical cancer screening program, and I've seen Adrian's data several times over now about diversity and disparities in cancer screening rates for the LGBT population, specifically around mammography and cervical screenings. So we are very interested and invested in working with providers for tips and tricks to continue to promote and increase cancer screening rates amongst the LGBT population, but I'm always looking for tips that we can share that may kind of make access to these screenings better for the LGBT population. So I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so a lot of times what happens is when folks with cervixes go in for care, if they don't identify as women, they're surrounded by things that say women and things about pregnancy and things about, having a female body and all this stuff, and it can be very dysphoric for people. What I personally would like to see is either a men's gender clinic, a TQ gender clinic, or something to that effect where, like trans and queer, sorry. Here I am just like making a moniker for it. But I would like to see a clinic that is specific for people who are gender diverse so that folks don't feel like they have to out themselves by going to an appointment under those circumstances.
Just to push back on that.
Please.
Those kinds of places are probably only going to exist in urban areas.
Right.
So, you know, as Todd said, they're capable of 67 counties.
That's true.
So, you know, I work at Adagio Health, these are a fairly rural population. So what about those folks who may not be able to access friendly?
So under those circumstances, you have to take the clinics that exist and make them more open, make them more friendly. Have things like, you know, we serve all genders here, have signs like that, have gender neutral restrooms, make sure that everybody is aware that that is a thing that you are supporting and promoting. For my position, what I do is I do trainings across our entire healthcare system, so from Erie to Canonsburg to Jefferson, everywhere. And what we're trying to hit is a lot of these rural clinics that are primary care providers that may see some folks that are coming in from more rural areas but can't travel all the way into Pittsburgh for care. So that's always a point of conversation for folks is you may be the first healthcare provider that somebody sees. You might be the first healthcare provider that somebody tells that they're trans or gay or whatever. So we want to make sure that that experience is affirming wherever it occurs. So yeah, in that case, it would be a matter of modifying the existing clinics. I see you and then I see you.
My question kind of tags along with hers because I work in a rural area. I'm a nurse. I have been for, you know, over 20 years. I'm very used to asking people detailed questions about surgeries, medications, and all that. So how do we, you know, without being offensive or making someone upset, make sure that we're ordering the right screenings, you know, prostate, breast, cervical, kind of like she was talking about. You know, what's the best way to approach that, I guess, without being too intrusive?
Yeah. So for that, I always recommend prefacing it with, these questions are probably going to be uncomfortable. You want to start with asking people, how do you refer to your body parts? Do you want me to use medical terms? Do you have specific terms that you want me to use? Open up with that. And then we do what's called like an organ inventory of, here's a checklist of all the body parts you could possibly have. Tell me which ones you were born with, tell me which ones you had removed, tell me which ones you had added or surgically modified, and we'll go from there and discuss it from there. So that's usually the best approach for people. Again, talking about body parts can be extremely dysphoric, so even just acknowledging that and being open about that with people can go a long way, and then you can have those conversations of, I want to provide the best care possible, you're here for health care, this doesn't go any further than the two of us, but here's why I need to know these things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you have like templates that you use in your organization?
No.
Like, okay. When you talked about like the body parts, I thought maybe you had like a...
So I think there is, if you give me your email, I can send you something. I believe that there is an organ inventory listed. I don't know if it's on WPATH or if it's under Fedway or something. We're trying to get it implemented into Epic. I'm a really optimistic person, so I'm really confident that it'll be in there by the time I retire. We'll see. Go ahead.
Thank you.
When one of the trainings we do is a LGBTQ cultural competency training, and we are very careful to use, when talking about pronouns you use as opposed to pronouns you prefer.
Yep.
But as pronoun conversations enter the mainstream, that is something that, unfortunately, like potential very strong allies say a lot. Like my preferred pronouns, do you have, and I feel a little clunky about my response to this, do you have like a pretty succinct way to frame why we use pronouns you use as opposed to prefer?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
I just ask, I rarely say preferred, I just say what pronouns do you use, what are your pronouns, because pronouns are individual, it's not a matter of, you know, biological versus whatever, you know, we say gender or identified gender, we don't say preferred gender because that's not necessarily accurate. But yeah, I avoid the word preferred usually, unless we're talking about, you know, my order at Starbucks. So.
So, like, the big issue with microaggressions is that people don't know they're doing them, and they don't want to be told that they're doing them. Everybody's really invested in believing that they're a good person.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you are faced with a situation where someone you interact with regularly is so invested in seeing themselves as a good person that they actually actively use it as an excuse to perpetuate not so great things towards minorities around them, like the people who will do grammatical backflips in order to never use pronouns on a person, and they say it's because they don't want to screw up and they don't want to offend them. But that seems so much harder to do than just using their pronouns. So there's something more there. There just kind of has to be.
Right.
So is the approach for this person to convince them that they are doing microaggressions and they need to work on that, or is it to just keep correcting and keep trying to educating without ever addressing that in particular?
Depending on the person. Again, some people are going to be open to hearing it depending on where it's coming from. Some people are just never going to be open to hearing it. I would ask that person, you know, why do you feel you have such a hard time with pronouns? Why are they hard for you? Are you still conceptualizing of this person as their sex assigned at birth as opposed to seeing them as the gender that they are? Opening that conversation, making sure you're having it in private so that they don't feel, you know, attacked or anything like that. And maybe expressing to them how that may come across to that person, because in their mind they're saying, I don't want to offend anybody. I'm not going to do anything that's going to offend anybody. And someone explaining to that person, you know what, you're actually hurting that person by not affirming their identity. Let's talk about some ways that maybe you can do that. So whether that's using neutral language, whether that's practicing by saying, you know, telling a story about this person and using their pronouns the whole time, you know, again, in a private setting where you're able to practice, you know, whatever it is that's going to be the best for that person. But I definitely think calling it out in a way that affirms that that person doesn't want to hurt somebody. You know, what I tell people all the time in training is nobody gets into healthcare because they want to intentionally harm someone, except for that Dr. Beth podcast, if anybody listens to that. That guy's not relevant here. But so that would be an example of, you know, you're validating that that person wants to do everything right, but you also want to point out where they're coming up short and how that might be hurtful to somebody. Yeah.
I just want to offer up, because of the level of question is okay.
Yeah.
I'm a family planning coordinator and a Title X coordinator for a program also called, it's called Healthy Woman PA, and it pays for cancer screening. We've adapted it because we serve the LGBT community. We call it Healthy Parts. And I have a lot of literature and some other resources. If anyone wants to reach out, I'm happy to speak with them in addition to the excellent training that we've provided.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Looks like we are at time, so if anybody still has questions, I'll be hanging out for a little bit. There's my email if anybody wants to email me later. Otherwise, thank you for your attention. Have a great rest of your day.